We have a keynote speaker now, so don't go anywhere. We move to an address now that is kind of a good segue once again from this last session. We have with us Dr. K. Vijay Raghavan speaking on the title, Overcoming the Vaccine Challenge in India. Dr. Vijay Raghavan was the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India from the 3rd of April 2018 to the 2nd of April 2022, a really hot period, of course. Prior to that, he was the Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Government of India in 2013, and from then to 2018. He's also a distinguished professor at the National Center of Biological Sciences, TIFR, and was the NCBS director till 2013. Dr. Vijay Raghavan is a fellow of the Indian Science Academies, the Royal Society, the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Padma Shri by the government in 2013. Doctor, it's over to you now. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Venkatesh. You know, one of the nice things about sessions going beyond their time and the next speaker arriving on time is I get to hear the wonderful conversations in the previous sessions. And that was very, very illuminating. The point which was made then relates to what I will be talking about now, is about how one can have digital access to everyone in a manner where it's personalized and security is also taken into account. There was also another important point made there, that is it possible through digital approaches to get a sense of the health of the population, particularly, for example, if fevers are growing in some sector and not in others, and this could be early warning signs. So let me from there take on to where we need to go about vaccines. Now, the characteristic of vaccines in the current age, as distinct from the previous era, are important and significant for us to keep in mind. In the previous era, we had no hurry on our hands. You know, we had to have vaccines against smallpox, against many enteric diseases, childhood vaccine preventable diseases, and so on. But they had one important characteristic there. These were all, for good or for worse, efforts substantially led by developed countries with a view to save the world, particularly in less developed countries, having saved themselves in many ways for pediatric illnesses and so on. In other words, there was no urgency to have vaccine deployment on scale for vaccine preventable diseases in the low and middle income countries. They rolled out steadily over decades. They had an enormous impact. Indeed, if you look back and ask, if this were 1947, many of us on the screen are likely not to have survived and gone past childhood. And the reason for that is improved healthcare, and amongst that, vaccines have played an enormous role. So that was the past. Now, those vaccines they fell into broadly two categories: attenuated viruses, and these were used, in many cases for as vaccines. Polio is an example, rotavirus is an example. And the other were inactivated viruses against whom, along with adjuvants, antibodies were raised, neutralizing antibodies were raised. Then came a new era which we're seeing today, in which this started about more than a decade ago, where there were vaccines which were expressed by recombinant DNA methods. Proteins were expressed on virus or bacterial surfaces, and they were used for immunization. And these kinds of vaccines were very, very important and had a great impact. And more recently, we've had the mRNA vaccines. Now, one of the important characteristics of the vaccine industry is something which has prevented also their deployment on scale, but has also resulted in vaccines being developed. And that is very simply this: vaccines, by and large, are a volume business, and they're a volume business with low profit margins for many of these companies. So they will make the Western companies will make high-end vaccines for products which are very important when people go on tourism, or for other projects which are part of the national immunization system, which, cost is not such a very important criterion, measles, for example, and so on and so forth. In the low and middle income countries, enteric disease, meningitis, many new viral diseases are all very, very important. But those are not attractive for the big companies. The result of this has been the growth of companies such as Serum in India, companies in Indonesia, in Brazil, and these companies are growing their vaccine development on the back of science at the US National Institutes for Health, in many Western laboratories, some cases in Asian laboratories. And therefore, in other words, the vaccine development costs have been enormously subsidized by public efforts globally. Then, along with that, they partner with international charities to develop vaccines locally. These vaccine developments require enormous skill and are not to be sniffed at, and they require safety standards. But also, when you scale, it is one thing to make potential vaccines in laboratory at the bench. It's quite another thing to go through all the trial processes nationally and internationally and make them on scale. And that something companies like Serum, Bharat Biotech, Biological E, and many other new companies coming into India now have accomplished very well. So it's for no small reason that India is known as the vaccine capital of the world. 2 out of 3 vaccines administered to children globally are from India. At least I would say 250 million African lives have been saved by vaccines against meningococcal disease, against pneumococcal disease. So there are extraordinary, examples of vaccines being effective. Now, going ahead, what is the challenge? Typically, vaccines take, about 10-ish years to develop or more. They cost about, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion to develop. And then, they're made against diseases which are already prevalent or endemic in different regions. And then there's a big challenge now in, getting it into the immunization program, who's going to pay for it and so on. With COVID, the whole world has been turned upside down. What took 10 years to develop now takes 1 year to develop. What, took, hundreds of millions of dollars has actually become even more expensive now, because you want to develop vaccines very rapidly without cutting corners. So it's not inexpensive. But the very interesting thing is India has moved from this earlier phase, which I told you, where vaccines were designed elsewhere and scaled up and manufactured here. So India was a vaccine scaling up and manufacturing hub. India has now become a vaccine developer hub, and there are dozens of companies now making vaccines at different stages. They will take some time to crack the global market and get on, but they're very, very innovative vaccine developers coming. In addition, the COVID pandemic has spurred the development of vaccines in the livestock sector. Foot and mouth disease and other diseases are widely prevalent, but there's every reason to believe that just as we've had a pandemic now in humans, that there is a real possibility of having a pandemic for livestock. And so that's also an industry which is going to grow. Let me end, and then I'll take questions, with a big challenge which we have. One of the consequences of the pandemic was that our big vaccine manufacturers, in particular Serum, initially was expected to serve not only India, but all over the world. But the severity of the Delta wave and the subsequent requirement for large-scale rapid vaccination in India meant that our commitments or our delivery internationally had to wait a little bit for our attending to our population. So there's an argument coming forth in countries such as in Africa and elsewhere that if you rely on supply chains of a few large producers to deliver to the whole world, then in an emergency, their reliability for other countries, when the internal demand is so high, is a challenge. Now, this may be a knee-jerk immediate reaction because, as I said, it's not a trivial job to manufacture vaccines on scale. And therefore, it's not a trivial job to set up and break the supply chain. Yet this has raised an issue. So I would say there's an opportunity for Indian industry to go into different other contexts and in an open source manner help set up vaccines and their development, take them through clinical trials so that there are multiple nodes in supply chains which are modestly strong rather than a few strong supply nodes, so that in case of another emergency, vaccine supply globally, equity and access is ensured. For that, it's not just making a candidate vaccine in the laboratory, but going through the preclinical tests. Animal tests are very important and must be widely and speedily available. And going through the early stage trials, phase 1 and phase 2 perhaps, and wait in case of an emergency to rapidly go through phase 3 and deploy. All this requires capability, capacity building, and importantly, resources. There is a tendency in these sectors to say that why should I invest in a safety belt? Why should I invest in an airbag? And until the accident takes place, these things are not useful. But as you know, this is a wrong argument. You cannot buy a safety belt just as the time before the accident. You have to invest in it in your car in advance. You have to invest in an airbag in advance. And similarly, you must invest in vaccine development in advance, even though it is not immediately commercially profitable. This requires multilateral organizations internationally to raise resources and invest in obviously imminent potential threats, as also be prepared through development of capacity for tests which for diseases which we don't know yet and which may rapidly come. So this is a very big challenge, but we have the capacity, as we've seen in the pandemic, to overcome, even with difficulty, these kinds of challenges. So the road ahead is tough, but we know what to do. And we must do that by investing in resources and in capacity building, in addition to scaling up the capacity which we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Dr. Vijay Raghavan. A lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to start with a very basic one, actually, because he's here talking about what the future of vaccines is going to be. And we've been speaking about vaccine hesitancy also today. We've touched upon it directly. So someone has asked a question, Arun Gaggar, there is talk of a fourth wave in India. And how serious would it get, according to you? How many waves will COVID-19 have before it completely disappears?
You know, these kinds of questions are understandable, but I would say at this stage, asking such questions is different from asking it at an earlier stage. So leave that particular question aside and look at it from the point of view of how these kinds of waves occur. There are three major components to it. One is how the virus itself changes. What are the spaces for change available to the virus? Once those spaces for change are available, and they're available in two broad ways. One, they're by infecting a large available population. And the second is by incubating, let's say, in a small number of immunocompromised people. Then the virus can change a lot. Now, this large available population is a second component. Because of prior exposure and vaccination, that available component for expansion of changed viruses or for them to change is substantially lower. So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect is massive immunization programs and prior exposure means that the kinds of cases which are coming up, even in terms of escape, are typically those which have mild symptoms. The changed viruses do not yet have resulted in extraordinary severity, and therefore the hospital system is not overwhelmed now as it was earlier. So going ahead, it is not unreasonable to think that we must take precautions and watch carefully, assay the cases and so on and so forth, and make sure that anything which is more troublesome which comes up is acted upon early. That capacity is there. There are some tools, in addition to newly developing rapid vaccines, there are drug targets which are becoming more useful. And therefore, one has to see how one can go to the next stage without having an overload of the system as you've had. will this become chronic like with other diseases remains to be seen.
It's even in a forum like this where we were speaking about a lot of technical issues and we've done deep dives all this afternoon. We have had a number of questions on vaccines and vaccine hesitancy, which is on one hand, it's not surprising at all because we at Boom, we've been dealing with a lot of vaccine related misinformation and hesitancy. But on the other hand, it is also kind of shows that this is a question that is top of mind. And so maybe I'll just take a couple of questions and then we can move on to the next session, Doctor. So we have Sapna Lunawat saying trials were actually required first and then mass vaccination should have been carried out. And that's just a comment. We have other people coming in saying that, again, about the fourth wave and asking questions. They're asking questions about side effects of vaccination for children. And someone anonymous again asks, do you really think boosters should be administered? So I think I'll just reframe all these questions and just ask you what your view is specifically on boosters and vaccination for children.
Well, very simply, if you've been exposed to the disease and if you've been vaccinated, you will have immunity. That immunity will wane. That immunity has got two components: your ability to have antibodies against viral surface components, neutralizing antibodies, and you're developing what's called a T cell response, which remembers your prior exposure. So even as antibodies wane, your native immunity wanes, you're going to have protection through other methods, which therefore mean that when you're exposed again, you're more likely to get mild to moderate symptoms. In that situation, boosters have to be calibrated in priority to a population where this waning of immunity is much more rapid. Those are older people and younger people with comorbidities. If vaccines are available, they are affordable, then you would expand it to a larger population. But that would be a prioritization steps. Now, for children, the answer is also similarly simple. What number of children, and we have getting that data globally, and we need to examine that nationally, when exposed to the currently spreading viral variants, do they show symptoms of significance which require immunization and which might result, if immunization is not done, in hospitalization? If that number of hospitalization is very low, that the current variants have very little danger to children, then again one has to take a priority of vaccination depending on that.
We'll leave it at that. Dr. Vijay Raghavan, thanks so much indeed for speaking with us and also taking those questions which seem to be popping up again and again. Again, no surprises there. Thanks so much.